again. My name is Lars. We had about 15 minutes break here. We're going to go ahead and start with the RhoSync section of the webinar. So what I'm going to go through is installing the RhoSync gem, which is a new structure for our RhoSync synchronization framework. And then I'm going to walk through building a store RhoSync application that will connect to our store roads application that Brian built in the previous section. So I'm going to go ahead and actually what I already have here is the RhoSync gem installed. But if you wanted to install it, you could just install it with sudo gem install RhoSync -- pre. Okay. And now building a RhoSync application is very similar to building a roads application. What we're going to do is first generate the app using the command line tool RhoSync. And this is going to generate several files for us. Let's go ahead and go in there. RhoSync applications are web applications that use the Sinatra framework. So you'll see a Sinatra rackup file, which is used to initialize several components of the RhoSync library, as well as set up the routes and start the server. There's an application.rb, which is your where you can put business logic relating to your application that is not tied to a specific source. You'll also do things like authentication, which is where you implement the authenticate method. You can override the initialization steps, things like that. There's a rake file that's provided just for helping with loading the different build utilities that come with RhoSync. Then in the settings folder, there's a license key. By default, you will get a license key that supports up to 10 devices. And then there's a settings file, which, if you're familiar with Rails, it's similar to the Rails database YAML file, where it configures the development, test, and production environments for how it connects to Redis. It also sets up your license file. And this sync server setting is used when you log into the web console. And there's also some a spec helper, which I'll cover later in the tutorial about which we're going to use RSpec for doing test-driven development of our source adapters. So let's go ahead and generate a source. The source adapter, if you're not familiar with it, is a bit of server-side code that is going to allow us to connect to our back-end web service. In this case, I'm going to use the RhoStore Rails application that Brian used previously. And it's going to interact with that web service to query, create, update, and delete records. And that data will be transparently synchronized to the roads application. So what I'm going to do is just use the same generator to generate a product adapter. And when I generate this, it's going to give me two files. One is the product adapter, it's called product.rb, and the other one is a spec that we're going to use to test our product adapter. The important thing to note here is I can test my product adapter in isolation from the roads application. So this will help you do more iterative and rapid development of your source adapter. So let me go back here to my directories, and now you'll see I have a sources folder which contains the spec and the actual adapter. And if you've followed along on our training wiki page, I'm going to basically be covering implementing this adapter as it is on that page. So first thing I'm going to do is get rid of login because I don't need it for this example. If you wanted to do some custom login logic, for example, if you had a SOAP service that needed to log in before it can make any requests, then you would implement the login method. So to start with, let's implement our query method. I'm going to require a couple of libraries. And actually, before I get started with that, I'm going to set up my spec. And in my spec, what I want to do is I want to first create a test product in case my web service doesn't have any products. I just want to make sure that I always have at least one product to test with. So my test is going to first create the product and then it's going to query for them. So let's create a product. Let's call it Nexus 1. Brand Google. Price. And since I'm dealing with a property bag model here, everything in between RhoSync and roads is stored as strings. So all of my data here is going to be reflected as strings. And I can obviously convert it to anything I want later. Okay. So in my test, what I want to do is first go ahead and create using the test create function. I want to create my product. And then what I'm going to do is try my query method. So I'm going to call test query. This will actually return the data from my query method, so I can do a check right on this function. And let's check the size. I should get at least one record. And just to make sure there are no errors, I'm going to check using the query errors helper. Okay. So before I actually write any code, I'm going to run this spec. Oh, and actually what I forgot to do here is start up my Redis server. Okay. So now my test runs, and you see that my assertion here that I should get at least one record back failed because I didn't implement my query method. So in my product adapter, because I don't return anything, I actually raise an exception, the test will fail. So let's go ahead and implement the query method. First I'm going to set up I'm going to set up an instance variable here for my base URL just so I can reuse it later. And I'm going to write this. Oops. Cut away a little too much there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use the REST client gem, which is a very useful gem for dealing with web services or just resources using HTTP in general. So I'm going to go ahead and use the REST client gem to pull down the JSON feed. You'll remember the JSON feed that Brian talked about previously. I'm going to get that same exact JSON feed. And I'm going to go ahead and parse it, so it'll turn it into a Ruby structure. First, let me set up my @result hash. The @result hash is what the RhoSync system will use to take the data and store it into our storage engine, which is powered by Redis. So I want to initialize that, and I'm going to go ahead and parse it. Now what I'm going to do is I need to take this parsed JSON body and actually turn it into a nested hash of hashes. This is a data structure that RhoSync will use and understands to synchronize automatically with the RHOS application. So I'm going to go over each one here. And the key that I'm going to use for the object ID, for each record here is going to be in my individual item. There's actually a product hash, and in that product hash, there's an ID key. And just make sure, I want to make sure it's a string because it might come back as an integer. Everything in RhoSync and RHOS is a string. And then I'm going to actually assign it to the product hash directly. Now, obviously, if your service was a little more complicated, for example, if it was a SOAP service and you had to do more parsing, you could do that here. But in our case, it's very simple. JSON feed. And then I'm just going to return @result at the end. Now, if I still run this test, we're going to notice it's still going to fail. And one of the reasons for that is in my test, I actually create a record before I do the query. So I'm going to need to implement create as well. So to create a record, I'm going to use the REST client post, and it's going to take the URL, and then it's going to take a product parameter. And in this case, because my RHOS application is posting exactly the attributes that I need, I don't need to do anything with this create hash. I can just use it directly. And what we'll need to do in order for this create to work properly is I need to return the new ID from my web service for this record. Because this record doesn't exist yet, I have to go ahead and fetch that new ID. And that new ID is in the response to my post. So what I'm going to do here is actually make another get call. Based on the headers. In this case, I get a location header because it's doing a redirect. And call it JSON. And then I can directly parse this result. And in this case, it's going to give me another product hash where there's an ID key. So as long as I return this in my create method, what will happen is RhoSync will now keep track of the new object ID that was created, and it'll tell the client, tell the RHOS application, okay, you created this record, here is the ID, and it will the RHOS application will use that new ID. So now if I go ahead and run my test, looks like we have another error here. Let me check my product spec. Oh, since I'm using RSpec, I need to use the double equals. Okay, so now it works. And if we go to the If we go to this products list, I should see several records because I've run the test multiple times. Here I see 2 Nexus 1 records. So just for completeness, I'm going to go ahead and add more tests here, one for the create method. We're already doing create, so we should actually have a test for it. And I just want to make sure that this new product ID that I return in my create method is valid. So it should not be nil. I shouldn't have any errors when I create it. And I'm going to use a helper here called MD. What MD is it's a helper that returns the, in RhoSync terminology, the master document that we store in the RhoSync system. So what RhoSync will do is when it queries this data, it will store it in a single document, a master document. And there are 2 ways to store this data. One is to have one master document for each user of the system, and we call that a user partition. The other way is to have one master document for all of the users in the system, and we call that app partition. Useful case for an app partition would be if my product catalog didn't change between users. If there was just one product catalog that everyone shared, I could just store that using the app partition, and then in my Redis database, I would only have one copy of the data for everybody. So in this case, I'm going to call the master document, and I'm going to check that this new product was included in there. So that means that this master document is going to be synchronized with the new product to all of the devices. And let me go and run my test again. So now I should have 2 out of the 4 tests running.